Mr. Kranz, thank you for taking the
Thank
time.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm curious right off the bat, what's it like for you to be back in this room? Anytime you're in here, what goes through your mind? Do you go back to those Apollo missions?
No, it's almost like I've never left. I got in here frequently after retirement. I was talked to the co-ops and the interns and all that kind of stuff. Various VIPs that would come along running on the line, but it really didn't look like, it wasn't mission control to me. Basically, it was configured for the shuttle program, and then it was abandoned for a while. Parts were missing from the consoles, abort switches for some reason or other. All three of them were put down on the flight dynamics thing. So basically, it was just sort of a hybrid that did not make sense. The room layout was still basically the same, but it wasn't home. Basically, I grew up in here from the very beginning when we built Mission Control. And then as we went through the Gemini program, we had consoles. We didn't have as many TVs, a lot of meters in here. But basically, as time moved on, it moved into what I'd say more or less what you would consider the modern age. The major change started to come about in the room here about the mid-period in the Gemini program. And it was now configured as it is today with one exception. Our experience in the early Apollo indicated that we had to have a central communications position within the room. Prior to that time, actually, the LEM people were handling LEM communication, command service module were handling command service module communications. This room here has been home. I spent my entire life here from a standpoint of 1962 to 63 when it was fabricated, all the way through 1994.
So as we're coming up, obviously, on this huge 50-year anniversary of that Apollo 11 mission, how often, I'm curious, do you find yourself going back and thinking about that mission?
It has been almost constant now. I did a program at the Smithsonian for the Flight Jacket Night. And this was very enjoyable for me because I've been sort of frustrated that they never did a good movie showing mission control during the landing. It's always the crew in the final 3 minutes. And I said, well, but we had to get them to that final 3 minutes down. It was a battle. We had problems with communication, we had problems with navigation, computer program alarms, etc. So basically, when we were doing the restoration here, they found a DVD containing some 16 millimeter film that was shot by a photographer by the name of Bird. And I looked at it and I said, but God, that's mission control during the landing. But it was, 16 millimeter, 100 foot was roughly about 3 minutes of film. So everybody took snippets. And if the cameraman didn't know what he was looking for, you had this and then there. It's sort of like kids when they get their first television camera down there. They're all over the place. Well, this is the stuff. So I looked at it and said, I got to speak up at the Smithsonian, and I'm going to talk about Apollo 11. I am going to, turn this into a film. It turned out to be 12 minutes long. And I'm going to narrate this based on my log, the crew's report, post-mission report, the air-ground voice transcripts that we have there. And it was really a lot of fun to try to piece things together that had never been tied together. Bringing the post-mission report into what was happening in the mission gave me a sort of visibility in why Neil Armstrong was doing some of the things he was doing. This also gave me a greater insight into concerns on board the spacecraft relative to the program alarm. So this was a very enjoyable time. So I have lived the Apollo 11 mission in detail since late last summer. And I'm enjoying the dickens out of it because I'm revising it now. Now I'm talking up in Denver for events up there, up at Purdue. I got one down in Galveston we're going to do.
So you're constantly reliving it in a way.
Yes. Well, basically, I don't really. When I walk into the room, I don't have to relive it. As soon as I walk into this room, this seems crazy, but I hear things. I can hear John Llewellyn say, I don't know where I was, but he didn't either. And he said, when I see that guy, I'm going to tell him what I thought about him. I can hear John Aaron called flight, have the crew go SCE to aux. So I can hear things, events. The one thing that is different right now is I don't smell the pizza, I don't smell the cigars and cigarettes anymore. They've cleaned this up. In fact, they cleaned it up so much that when they're doing the room restoration, they have the return air ducts down there were as black as this suit here from the nicotine star. But now even that's clean, so I don't feel it's quite right yet. We still got to mess that return air duct up. I've spent some time in that recently. Again, it's looking back. You know, at the time President Kennedy made that speech, for the previous 4 years, Sputnik had been orbiting overhead. 1 year prior to that speech, Yuri Gagarin had been placed in orbit. In Mercury Control, we had just blown up our second Atlas rocket. We turned around and a week later launched Alan Shepard, and then we got the John Kennedy speech. And I sit down and say, what a confluence of events here. That man here had been must have been under intense political pressures. Basically, he had to really address the nation and get this nation moving again. And I think it was ready. It was waiting for a call like this. I think the 60s, the early 60s, was a marvelous time because people were not watching television. They were out marching for their beliefs. Civil rights movement. Basically, you had the Freedom Corps, that you had the U.S. Corps they had in there. They had the, I'm losing my track of mind here. The things, people were marching in the streets. Civil rights movement was going. Basically the environment movement going. They had the protests you had beginning in the for and against Vietnam. You had the space program. All these things were going on, and people were involved in them. I mean, I think America was more involved at that time, other than any other time in history, other than during wartime. So it was I think it was a great time for America, and Kennedy's speech, I think, ignited the fire. Let's go do it.
It motivated people like you to take on the challenge, right? And it was did you think it was crazy, that level of
well, I was already working on the space program at that time, but it was sort of like, gee, that's nice, but it's time we get John Glenn in orbit. Let's concentrate and just on John Glenn right now. Let's worry about the moon. Let somebody else worry about that. I think that was a great challenge, and it took a while to sink in.
Now, you don't get to Apollo 11 without, of course, Apollo 1, and I've heard you talk about the significance of what happened there as well, in terms of losing men. Could you talk about how that is something you carried with you?
Apollo 1 was interesting. We had just finished the Gemini program, and basically they had the first three flight directors for Apollo 1 were John Hodge, myself, and Chris Kraft. And John came off after the Gemini 8 mission. He started working Apollo. I came after Gemini 9. Chris was starting working in Gemini 76. But basically we had less than about 6 months to turn around to get ready. And basically I was basically hard-pressed to be prepared myself. And I had worked the final Gemini missions, and at times while we were flying Gemini, the flight controllers in the console that were working there were actually doing their schematics and mission rules and flight plan stuff. So I said, gee, are we giving the right attention to the mission that's in place? But this was the nature of the workload at the time we were transitioning from Gemini to Apollo. I was the flight director on console for the plugs out test, and this was basically a dress rehearsal of the terminal countdown right up to the point where you transfer from external power to internal power in the spacecraft. And we had an enormous amount of communications problems in there, and it took basically, this was a test that should have taken roughly about 6 hours, and it was virtually a day long. And I finished that test. We had sorted out most of the comm problems. So I elected to turn around and provide support the next day's test and get the power up, get everything working, and then hand over to Chris Kraft. And I handed over around noontime there, and basically I went back to the office, took a look at the work that had to be done, and then basically I was going to take my wife out. We hadn't been out for a long period of time. We had 5 kids at that time, and basically I wanted a break. I needed a break. And about the time we were getting dressed, I heard the pounding of the door, and the neighbor came over and said, Gene, he worked in the space program. He was one of the lunar module guys. Came over and said they had an accident, and they think the crew's dead. And boy, that all he said is when I heard the word dead, I got rolling. And at the time I arrived here in Mission Control, the place was locked up. I couldn't get in. And fortunately, I knew where the doors were for all the tech forces, where they basically brought in the heavy equipments and all that kind of stuff, all the equipment they had to move in Mission Control. So I came in through there and got in upstairs. And when I walked in, it was obvious that we had lost somebody. And it was the impact. These are young kids sitting in the consoles. And they had never gone through an experience like this before. Hodge had. He was working in flight test. I had lived and worked in flight test and flown aircraft in Korea. So we lived with this. So it was a question of how do we get these people going again? And everybody hung around playing back the data, trying to get the answers and find out what happened and why it happened. There was an embargo on the phone calls going out at that time. And finally, Chris just gave the call, okay, everybody pack it up. It's time to go home. We went out to we used to have a bar, the watering hole, called the Singing Wheel, which is on Highway 3. And we went all over the Singing Wheel, and the proprietor there moved all other people out. Basically, it was myself and my controllers. And late at night, the wives started showing up to take their people home. And it was a time of, I won't say reflection, but a time that says somehow or other we got to get going and get back on track, and we got to get these kids convinced that this type of an accident is the price of progress. If we want to go to the moon, we had expected to lose people somewhere in flight. We had never done it before. It happened on the launch pad. They faced it, but basically it is up to us to get together, get this program working again. And 3 days later, that was 2 days later, which is Monday, John Hodge, who was the division chief at that time, basically reported on what was happening. Sam Phillips, they had established a committee to investigate the accident. So he sort of went through the responsibilities there, and then I finished. And I had worked in flight test. I had a cartoonish kind of card in there that showed an airplane that crashed into a tree. And it says, aviation, unlike the sea, is terribly unforgiving of carelessness, incapacity, or neglect. And I used those words now to start a discussion with my people. And basically it was up to the point of saying, we all have to accept responsibility for this accident. It wasn't just mission control, it wasn't the cape, it wasn't the crew. In fact, none of us said stop, halt. Time to regroup, get everything settled down, fix things, and then get on with it. And that's when I finished, left 2 words with them, tough and competent. You will write those in your blackboards, and you will not erase them until we have completed the Apollo program.
Did that loss help you get to the moon?
I think the loss was like many things in life. It was the focusing of it. It hardened us, it tempered us. Basically, it focused us more on good enough isn't good enough. It has to be perfect. And I think this was the characteristic we had, tough, meaning we're forever accountable for what we do or what we fail to do. Competent. We'll never again take anything for granted. We'll never stop learning. From now on, the teams in mission control will be perfect. And that was the name, perfect. No ambiguities. Absolutely the best we could do.
Can you take me back to the morning of the launch for Apollo 11? what was going through your mind as flight director? What was going on in here on,
Well,
on the day of the
Cliff
launch?
Charlesworth was the flight director. That was a free day for me because basically I was going to replace Cliff after he had gotten the crew on their translunar journey. So I was basically sitting there over in the shelf there. Launch day, you always want to be around, and I'd launched a few of these guys before. And it's a unique time. It's a time of intense focusing because everything in launch day has to go perfect. And the one thing that is really a question is mission control ready to go. And we got all kinds of mission rules that say you need this, you need that, running on the line. But we also know that once you get down, I'm always worried about this, when I get down into the final count, when they're out of sequence, and now all these valves are opening and closing, engines starting right on down the line, I would never call a halt during there. I would, whatever the problem was, I would say, we'll live with it once we get them up in orbit. Then we'll work whatever problem we got. The majority of the times we'd scrub would be for ground system problems and mission control. But basically, it's a question. The heart starts pumping a little bit, and you're mentally going through all of the things that this flight director is going to have to do, and you're just praying that we get through this first stage, because first stage you're going vertical. That's when you want to clear through what we call max Q, max dynamic pressure. You want to get through the atmosphere as rapidly as possible, and then you tip over and then start going. So now you're accelerating down there. And you can almost feel it. Down at the Cape when we launched an Atlas, we could feel it in Mercury control. Here we don't have that feel, but you can see this thunderous. I cheated. I'd sit back there and so I could look at Kraft's TV or TV that was up in the viewing room there. We didn't have it in mission control.
Did you believe in that moment that launch would be the one that would end up on the moon?
That was the flight director. That was Cliff's job. Okay, from my standpoint, my job was landing. Okay, and everybody asked the question, did I ever believe? Yes, I believed 100% that we're going to be successful. We're going to land that crew on the moon. And this is true whether it be Apollo 11, 13, whatever I had. Because as flight director, the relationship I must have with the crew is one that says he is never going to let me go. I'm going to come home. That guy's going to be there. And I say, this is sort of like a heart surgeon. Only the astronaut has got his chest pulled open and is looking into the surgeon's eye. And what does he want to see in the surgeon's eye? I'm going to get this guy through this therapy. I'm going to get this guy through this operation. He's going to be healthy. So it's really a question of this kind of intense belief in you. I have to have it. And I have to be able to communicate it to my team so that they expect to be 100% successful. From my standpoint, my job is to be cooler than cool, sharper than sharp, ready to go. And I think this was a modus operandi I had developed, both as a fighter pilot and back in flight tests. So basically, I was never not up to speed. I was ready to go. And a lot of times my controllers, when I was in the office, we'd always start workday at least a half hour ahead of time, and they'd hear the Stars and Stripes Forever played over their loudspeakers in their office. So they knew I was ready to go and expected them to be ready to go.
So take me inside this room on July 20th, 1969. What was it like in here?
The time frame as we came in, and we were all arrived here early dawn. And I remember coming up to the console here and talking to Glenn Lenny. And basically we'd skipped a shift, so we had almost 3 shifts worth of reading to do for the log and the handover. And Glenn looks at me and he says, it's all peanuts. So I knew that, okay, this is then I went to the back room, checked out with the engineers. They didn't have any squawks in there. The one thing that was abnormal is a flight director develops a relationship with his simulation supervisor. And my sim sup was Dick KHOU's, and he was not here, and that was strange. All of his team was here, but he wasn't here. Later, I found out he was in an auto accident. But basically, I come in the room now, a complete handover, and now it's by the numbers. The one thing that this was particularly true this day, was that we're running by the clock. And it's sort of like I vision myself almost as a quarterback in the red zone down there, calling the signals. 20 yards out this thing, and all we need is get a touchdown and score, and we're the winner. So that's basically the relationship that you have to have with the clock. Everybody else is working the same thing. So we can go through the procedures of having the crew enter in the lunar module, the crew enters in the lunar module. And then the computer on board the spacecraft is not too smart. Basically, it's a 64K machine, 16K erasable, and we have to tell the computer where the spacecraft is and where we want it to go. And if it gets those two sets of information, it can figure out how to get from point A to point B. But the problem is that as we load this computer now, we may go down in the current revelation and we're on, or I may wave off and go to second. So we got two sets of data we got there. So now we got two sets of the abort data if we get in there. So all of a sudden, all this information has to go up. So it's the information that's passed up to the crew by ground command and then by verbal is incredible. So we spend an entire rev doing this. Now we've undocked, we give the go for undocking, separation. The spacecraft separates, come around the front side. And this is going to be our last look at it until it comes around and we're ready to go to the room. And we have to now make sure that we're ready for a maneuver. We call it the descent orbit injection. Right now we're in an orbit that's roughly about 50 miles high. The descent orbit injection is going to bring us down to 50,000 feet where we will start the descent. So again, we have to make sure everything's go there, go through that, pass it up to the crew. And now, once the spacecraft goes behind the moon, we've got a brief period of roughly about 25 minutes where we can take a break, smoke break, go to the restrooms, come on back into mission control. And I have to talk to my people. And it's just a question of saying, we were made for this day. Basically, we'll remember what we're doing here always. And I went on for some more words. But then I finished up, I will stand behind every decision you will make. We came into this room as a team, and we will leave as a team. And then I say, ground control, go to battle short. This is a time when you really sit about it. He goes and locks the control room doors, and nobody can come in or out until we have either landed, we have crashed, or we have boarded. Those are the only three outcomes from now on. And it's now between me and my team and the crew and the spacecraft. They're the only people that exist in the universe. All the politicians in the viewing room, the bosses in the rows behind me, they don't count anymore. It's just me and the team and the crew. And it gets, you develop a routine, a relationship that is, I think, very unique in those days, because Neil knows I'm going to give my best, and I know he's going to give his best. So together, we're going to make this the first manned lunar landing. And
could you feel, I'm sorry to interrupt, could you feel was there nerves in the room? Could you feel that your people
No,
were
what
nervous?
happens, it's interesting. You got the communications panel in here. I would listen to my I call them my kids, my pups. I would listen to pull up their loops in there. I could listen to them talking to the backroom people, and I could sort of get a pulse check on them. So I could check every group in here and say, hey, they're cool, they're ready to go right on down the line. But now all of a sudden the spacecraft cracks the hill. And now we got communications with the command module, now we got communication with the lunar module, things are going. And my flight planner is sitting right next to me, and he says, hey, they're right on the timeline there, so I know things are going. And then all of the communications go to crap. We can't hear anything. We can't hear the crew. We can't give them the information they need. We have to voice instructions up through Mike Collins in the command module. He voices it down to the crew. So all of a sudden, things that were very easy to do with direct communication are now becoming really very laborious. And we all of a sudden get a break communication. We look at it, everything's looking good right on the communications again. Now, the question is, I have a mission rule that I have to basically implement. Do I have enough information to continue? Because if we'd crash or lose the spacecraft, we got to know what happened and why, and it's my judgment. So I'm saying, yep, I got enough data, let's continue the next thing. And finally we get to the point where I give them the go for powered descent. And as soon as I give them the go for powered descent, we lose communications again. And now we're running right up to the point. I've given the go. The engine's going to start. Are we going to have the data when the engine starts? Comes in briefly, and then we lose it again. This continues all the way through about the first 5 minutes of the descent. I'm just praying, because if we don't have enough communications, I'm going to have to abort this mission at 5 minutes after we started descent. All of a sudden it starts clearing up, so things are getting better. Now we hear the crew report, hey, they were belly up when they were coming across. Before we started down, they were feet forward looking down at the surface, and they were checking their landmarks. And they report to us that they're going to land long. Well, our trajectory confirms this also. We don't know why they're landing long, but basically this is a deviation in the trajectory that we hadn't expected. Flight dynamics officer says he's going to keep watching what's going on down there, etc. So now the reports coming in, they're pretty good, but again, the communications craps out. So now we're getting ready, and I got to make serious communication decisions, which is to continue the descent. Communication comes back again, make the decision to continue the descent. About this time, we're now looking for landing radar data, which is very critical. Because the information the crew is going, this is all being done automatically by the computer on board the spacecraft. The information they're actually traversing down there is based on altitude data that we've given them on the spacecraft. And this has got to be right. If you're going to land on the moon, you got to know where the moon is within a couple thousand feet. So we're waiting for that radar data to come in, and just as it comes in, we have a computer program alarm.
It's at the 1201.
1201. So they basically, the crew says 1201, and then there's a pause, and they say, could you give us a read on that? And Capcom reports, could we give him a read? And about that time, Bales has checked with his back room, and he says, yeah, we're going that alarm as long as it doesn't reoccur. So now we focus back on the landing radar. We get the radar data, and it's within a threshold that is acceptable to incorporate into the computer. If it were outside this threshold, that's an abort case right off the bat, because the computer has to know where it is, and it cannot digest a large amount of erroneous data, because we found out in training it would just turn upside down and drive straight to the surface to solve the problem. So anyway, so we're working computer program alarms right on down the line. Communications now are very good. And basically we're now tracking everything that's going on. We're cutting down the altitude rate right on the line until we get into the third phase of the descent. The first one is a braking phase. And then basically there's one is establishing the position for the final descent, where we will stop flying automatically and the crew will take over and go manual. By this time, however, the crew should have looked at their lot through the landing site. But basically the Armstrong was so disturbed distracted is a better word, by the program alarms. And he's a pilot. And pilots, if you have problems, the first ground rule is fly the airplane, and that's exactly what he is doing. He is watching that navigation and guidance system and how it's performing like a hawk down there every step of the way. So we finally get to the point where we give the crew the go for landing. From now on, it's up to the crew. Mission control is sort of out of the picture with the exception of one thing. How many times have you driven with your gas gauge in your car reading empty?
You're always watching.
A few times.
Few times.
Well, that's exactly what's happened to the crew now, because the tank is cylindrical with a rounded bottom in there. And the measuring gauge stops when it ends up the cylindrical portion. It's what we call low level. So the crew calls out low level. We confirm low level. So now we have 120 seconds of fuel at a 30% throttle setting. Okay? Now the crew's getting relatively low down. He's down around 1,000 feet, and he's now looking to where is he going to land. And he sees that if he's got a big crater out there, and he has to make a decision. He's going to land in front of the crater, or he's going to overfly the crater. Makes that decision to overfly the crater because he doesn't know how far he's got to get back and what's behind him. So he wants to always look and see what's out there for landing.
They're running out of gas at this point.
So basically, he's going to overfly the crater. And now an interesting thing happens in there. This is something we didn't expect, and the crew Armstrong is very good at this thing here. The surface dust is now flowing in the same direction he's moving, so he doesn't know that he's moving. He can't tell whether he's moving right, left, straight, or hook. So he has to pick out solid objects like rocks that aren't blowing around. And this is what he's now using as his reference for motion. In the meantime, Buzz Aldrin's calling these things down. And now we've had this low level, and it's now 120 seconds past, 2 minutes past low level, so we start counting down time. 60 seconds, 45 seconds, 30 seconds. And about the time we say fifth, we recognize the crew has just landed. And it's interesting, the crew's going through engine shutdown, and basically the control team is real cool in this. But the people in the viewing room recognize we landed, and they're stamping and clawing, and they're stomping their feet right on down the line. And this makes me pretty angry. So I call out to my controller, okay, everybody settle down, stand by for T1 stay no stay, because what we got to do is make sure it is safe to remain on the surface. So basically, we keep quiet for 2 minutes. Then I do the stay no stay decision. It's stay. We voice that up to the crew. We then go for another 6 minutes, 8 minutes. We go through a stay no stay decision, making sure the spacecrafts are still safe. Pass that up to the crew, and then we go for the next hour.
So, Mike, when do you celebrate?
So
do you celebrate?
We celebrated 2 hours after the landing. That was when we'd handed over to the team in mission control. And we had actually 2 teams in mission control, because there was, the surgeons felt that the crew might want to sleep if they get down on the surface. We never believed that was going to be the case, so I had a team that would pick up a sleep shift. I got the Cliff Charlesworth team, and he was going to do the EVA.
So, when you celebrated after 2 hours, what was it like in here? You told me they were celebrating back there.
Basically, they're celebrating here. Basically, we just backed off from the castle. I had to go to a press conference, and I always took some of my guys with me to the press conference just to show them off. But basically, when we came back, it was walking back from the media. It was one of the motels we used as a press conference out there. That basically, I really finally looked up and could see the moon up there. You could see the thing up there and say, hey, we just landed in the moon. That's pretty cool. But basically it was to the point where all we wanted to do is get back in and find out what the heck's going on. I mean, this was a unique time, and the team was absolutely sharp, crisp. If you want to hear the better version of this thing here, go online to the Smithsonian site, look at Flight Jacket Night, and you can see my home movie there, and that I'm narrating there. It really worked out like a champ. It turned out to be a lot of fun.
I've heard you say that you wish you could go back to that day.
Yes, I wish I could.
And you've said that you wish you could go back because you want to enjoy it more, because
I would
were
like
so
to
busy.
celebrate at the instant landing when the rest of the world is celebrating that thing, and the crew is celebrating, and they're backed off. But basically, we're all tied into this business of very professional, very capable, and top of the job. You see, it's interesting that in mission control, watching people work under stress is like watching grass grow. You just could never tell that there's a problem.
Was there any cheering in here at any point? Clapping? Anything?
There were a couple. We had a lot of guests who were sitting back. Behind me, to my left, I had Bill Tyndall. Bill Tyndall was, to me, one of the real heroes of the Apollo program. We should have named a crater after him in there, because he basically came up and basically brokered all the relationships between us and the crew, and between the technical community, and how we're going to use the computer, how far we're going to press, when we're going to call it a halt right on the line. Tyndall did what they call the there's a book of his memos that are about that big. He could sit there, listen to an argument, nobody agree. He would write a memo on it, make everybody laugh, and all of a sudden everybody agreed. He had found the answer. But anyway, I had Bill Tyndall here, and I had 2 other flight directors, Cliff Charlesworth and Glenn Lenny.
50 years later now, what do you think that day, that accomplishment for you personally, for NASA, for our country, what can we take from it 50 years later?
I think there's several things. Let me take the last one first. What I think is best for America. I think that it established, look at the complexity of this program, the hundreds of thousands of people working it, the difficulties we had through the Apollo 1 fire, through some of the testing right down the line, but all of a sudden these group of people kept working at the job and made things happen. And to me, it's a question of what America will dare, America can do. And I think really it's establishing a framework nationally that say, there's some tough things out here. What we got to do is we get all the people marching in the same direction. And what you need for that is you need top-level leadership, and you need leadership at many levels below that. You got to tie together the scientific, the engineering, the academic communities. You got to tell the politicians. You got to get the White House together. Everybody has to move in the same direction. And that is, I think, what Kennedy was able to do. That was a marvelous time to live. So I think that the key thing is it gives a good example of what can be done and the benefits from doing it. You know, you take a look at everybody says, look, cost. Basically, what was it worth? We won the Cold War. Okay, basically we won the war in space because we were fighting a war. I was a fighter pilot over in Korea and I saw a Russian aircraft. Basically, we won that. Basically, we set up an academic base. We basically revitalized our academic institutions, the colleges, universities, technology that came out. People started believing in themselves and what they can do. So I think it was what was benefit. For myself personally, it was just the pride in building a team that could do what most people thought impossible.
So what do you see the next step for us?
Well, there's several things. I think going back to the moon is the obvious one because I'm a camper. And when you go camping, you get out there the first time, you say, oh, God, I wish I had brought that. You brought a lot of the wrong stuff, but you didn't bring some of the stuff you should have had. And going to the moon is going to be like that. Only this time, if you're going to go to the moon, you're going to be there to stay. So you got to start bringing the right stuff the first time out. Now, we've got a good background in that. We've got a good background in space. So I think that is the first thing, was to get to some place where we can build this enclave and start building the systems. I think the space station is good from one thing because we found that we can assemble things that haven't been assembled here on Earth. CAD/CAM capabilities are great. I think the communications, the ability to tie together laptop computers all over that station is great. So I think there's a lot of the things we got going for us. What we got to do is decide to go. I think it'll be an international program, and it should be a freedom-loving countries that we should pull together under this mantra, because there are some good ones out there. You got India out there. You got basically all the freedom-loving countries of the world. We got all the European countries. We got Japan. These are the people that basically can benefit economically from this, because when you try to do difficult things, you invent new technologies. The space station's got long-lived systems. I find it hard to believe that some of these bearings that are rotating the solar rays to follow the beta angle with the sun have been operating up there for years. Well, basically, you want to go to the moon, you're going to be there for a long time also, but you're going to have to basically manage your resources better. You're going to have to recycle virtually everything. We're going to have to compact. So basically, I think that the opportunity for economic benefit is very great. What is needed is leadership. And it has to exist at all levels. It has to exist within basically our nation. And we have to build a plan. There's all kinds of plans. I've seen half a dozen plans that have come out of headquarters, out of various presidents down there, starting at Reagan and then through Bush, and then through basically Dan Golden. Everybody's got a plan, but basically what I want to do is put some money into that plan and put some leadership in there and make that plan happen.
Two more quick questions for you. I've heard you say in a documentary that people could not operate here in Mission Control unless they were Superman, and they could believe that they could solve any problem at any given moment. Could you talk about what you meant by that, obviously with the enormous challenges you guys were facing here?
The key thing here in Mission Control is building leaders. And leaders that are willing to step up and accept great challenges. To this, they have to, first of all, believe in themselves. They have to communicate this to a group of people, and they have to build a team, because anything that's going to happen nowadays is going to be done on a team basis. It's too complex, too fast-moving technology, costs too much right under the line. So you got to do it, and you got to do it right the first time. So I think that this business of establishing the belief in yourself that you can do these virtually impossible things, and you have to convince your team that you can do it, and they have to convince the people on the other side. This is conviction that goes as deep as America's deep. You have to go from here out to America's industry, out to the educational institutions, out to the financiers, people that are going to put, we need to get Congress. Everybody has to sign up for this. We can do the impossible.
What do you feel in your heart when you step outside on any given night and you see the moon?
That was, I had problems there because my son was a football player. We got 5 daughters in there, and basically they'd be cheerleaders and band and all that. And I was more interested in watching the moon and looking. We just landed up there. Just couldn't wait for a full moon to come along there. To me, it's out there. And it basically says, I'm still here. Come and get me. You know, it's that kind of stuff. You just have to develop the mental capacity to say, we got a lot of problems here on Earth. We got to solve them. We got financial problems. We got to solve them. But we can also sign up for doing big things. I compare this. The next journey to the moon is building the Panama Canal. Panama Canal, they had problems down there. The medical problems were, they had malaria. People were infested. The place would flood. They had to build huge dams up there to hold the water back while they were doing this, but they built it. And think about what would be going on today if we couldn't traverse from the Atlantic to the Pacific and back without that canal there. So I think it's a question of sign up to do the impossible.
People consider you a hero. I'm sure you've heard that. An American hero. Do you think?
No, I'm not. My team is. I always think about my team. My team was, I was nothing without a team. I've always worked as a team all my life. And my organization, you know, the culture of the organization was achievement through excellence. We had to have that. All I could do is convince the team they were as good as I thought they were.
Thank you so much, Mr.
Okay.
Kranz. I appreciate it.
Have a good one. Thank you.